to the January 2013 Local Authors Night, and we are happy to introduce William Sargent, who's the writer of these many science and ecological books all about the ocean and the beaches and the issues that are happening with them, and about many other topics in science. So I give you William Sargent.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. Normally I wear a coat and tie and make a big deal about taking it off, but I figured I wouldn't bother with that today. Let me see. I think I'll start with a very brief reading from this book, which is called Crab Wars, A Tale of Horseshoe Crabs, Bioterrorism, and Human Health. And basically the story behind that is that a quart of horseshoe crab blood is worth about $15,000. Wow. And they basically use it as a test for gram-negative bacteria. So whenever anything's going to be introduced into the blood system, whether it's a vaccine, any sort of intravenous fluid, you have to check to make sure that that's free of gram-negative bacteria. So for instance, all of the people who died from meningitis, they could have been saved if the injections had been tested with the horseshoe crab test. So it's basically one of the most commonly used medical tests in the world. It's used every day in all kinds of clinical settings, from major hospitals to tiny rural clinics, and it's all based on a single species of wild animal. And that animal is declining up and down the East Coast. So I tell you a lot of the things, sort of the history of the industry, and some of the things that they don't want you to know. So this is now the setup for this. I was about 12 years old, and I was living on the Cape, and I got very sick one summer, and I actually went into a coma. And they brought me to the Cape Cod Hospital, and the doctors didn't think they could do anything, and they told my parents, I think you really better get him transferred to the Boston Children's Hospital. So they transferred me up there, and I was still in a coma, and then I would wake up, or my mother would come in every day to see if I had woken up, and I had a wonderful nurse that stayed with me. So it goes like this. First lessons, Boston Children's Hospital, 1956. Mrs. Sargent, your son is all right, but I'm afraid there's been some brain damage. He's talking some nonsense about worms, crabs, and bugs. Well, that's all right. All he ever does is talk about worms, crabs, and bugs. So they knew that I was as good as I was ever going to be. Then my first book was called Shallow Waters, A Year on Cape Cod's Pleasant Bay. This was done in conjunction with a NOVA film about a year in the life of the bay, and it was a wonderful year. We spent every day either flying over the bay or diving in the bay or going across it on boats, sort of cataloging all of the changes. And of course we have a lot of underwater photographs and surface photographs, and actually there's a picture of my son, and I actually opened this up because I spent a good part of my youth standing, sitting on that bridge, looking down at the creatures, and I sort of knew a lot of them by name, and I figured out their behavior and what was going on. So it was kind of interesting to look back and see my son's, sitting on the same bridge. He now has a cooking show on the Cooking Channel called Hook, Line, and Dinner. So they just came back they did one in Hawaii and in Puerto Rico, and then one up in Maine, and then the most recent one was with call him the Eel Man in Delaware. So let's see. I'll just grab, well, since this is sort of a spring-like day, I'll do this one. Spring arrives on Pleasant Bay. Spring has its first tenuous grip on the land today. The April sun has thawed the ground, but winter lingers in the bay. Daffodils and crocuses have already bloomed, and tiny green leaves will soon emerge from the thorny stems of wild roses. I have waited for such a day to make my first dive of the year. It will require a thick wetsuit and full diving gear. and then I go on from there. Okay, let's see. Then I have, let's see, I have a series of books about sea level rise, and basically before Hurricane Sandy, Cape Cod was probably the best example of what happens when you get a major storm and you have a process called rollover. Normally I give slides, but it didn't seem like slides were going to be very appropriate, but that's okay because I have Italian heritage, so I can use my hands. First of all, does everybody know what this is?
Cape Cod.
No, that's my left arm. And can somebody tell me what state is most likely to get a major storm in any particular year? And go ahead.
North Carolina.
Yeah,
North
I would say
Carolina?
South.
Sorry?
So I would say somewhere in the south.
Somewhere in the south, North
Carolinas.
Carolinas. Anybody else?
Maybe the Cape.
New Orleans.
New Orleans. No, New Orleans is good. You're right. It's Massachusetts. And the reason for that is we get whacked by the hurricanes in the summer, and then we get the northeasters in the winter. And actually, northeasters tend to do more erosional damage because they hang around for several tidal cycles. So you might get, 4 or 5 high tides, and you'll just be pounding and pounding and pounding in on there. We have an interesting situation on Cape Cod. It's the Nauset Beach system. We have a barrier beach system that essentially goes from Eastham all the way down to the end of Monomoy. And the end of that beach grows about a half a mile every summer, every year. The reason for that is you get the northeast winds coming in around the wrist of the Cape, and that sets up longshore currents that are carrying that sand down along the arm of the outer beach. So as long as you've got that sand that's coming down there, the beach is going to grow longer and longer and longer, but it's also getting longer and thinner. And then this is all driven by sea level rise, but what we've found down opposite Chatham is you'll get a break opposite what's called Minister's Island. And then, for years everybody in Chatham called what we call up in Orleans, we call it Nauset Beach. In Chatham they always called it North Beach, but nobody knew why they called it North Beach. They've been calling it North Beach for hundreds and hundreds of years. As soon as the inlet opened, they realized, oh, okay, now we have a North Beach and a South Beach. And that had been the situation when the inlet had opened back, back in 1846. And then you had a North Beach and a South Beach. But then what happens is that the southern portion of the barrier beach is then considered what's called a relic island because it's no longer getting the sand that's coming down. So that sand is now going in the inlet. And without that sand to build it up, the island, you get a lot of erosion, and you also get a process called rollover. And for years, we used to think that a barrier beach island was just a stationary thing. And, it would be out there for hundreds of years, and it might erode, it might grow a little bit, but it was essentially stationary. After what was called the March storm, the Ash Wednesday storm in 1962, which was a devastating storm, very, very similar to Hurricane Sandy. It devastated the coast from Cape Cod all the way down to Florida. Hundreds of thousands of houses were washed away. The whole New Jersey coast was washed away. Most of the houses were washed away on the New Jersey coast. Those are the same houses that were rebuilt and then were destroyed again after Hurricane Sandy. But one of the things that they realized is that in fact the beaches were moving, and one of the interesting things as they found is that the beaches that didn't have any houses on them, didn't have any permanent structure, didn't have any streets or infrastructure, were able to recover very quickly, just in a matter of a couple weeks. they started to rebuild. But the other thing that happens is that there's a process called rollover, and there's a couple examples of this. In 1626, a bark carrying colonists that were going to the Virginia colonies went off course and went into the inlet into Pleasant Bay and ran aground. You know, a delegation from the Plymouth plantation went down and rescued them, brought them back to the Plymouth plantation. I guess they were kind of much too rowdy for the Pilgrims, and they finally sent them on their way back down to Virginia. But then everybody forgot about the wreck, and it just sort of stayed there. But then in 1836, all of a sudden they found the remains of a ship out here, but it was out of the outer part of the beach, and they didn't know how did that ship go 1,000 feet, you know, from in here over there. It just didn't make much sense. Now we realize that in fact what happened is that it was the beach itself that had rolled over. It had migrated over. So essentially this is what's happened down in New Jersey. Essentially the whole New Jersey coast has migrated back about 100 to 200 feet. All of that sand that was washed off the front of the beach, and then you see it in the streets and, you know, burying everybody's houses. That's a whole process of rollover where all those barrier beaches are just rolling over. So, you know, they're talking about rebuilding now, and one of the things that a lot of the communities want to do is that we've got to build the boardwalks right away because we have to have them ready for the summer so that we can, you know, generate tourist income. But unfortunately, if you build them back where they were before, they're going to be in jeopardy. So really, you should be building them back behind on the inside of the beach, and that's where your development is. And there's a lot. Actually, Governor Christie just announced that they have new regulations for how high the houses will have to be built. There was another example of that, the same rollover process. Probably about 10 years ago, there was a strip of peat that appeared off of Nauset Beach. And if you looked, you could see the tracks of hay wagons, and you could even see the hoofprints of horses and oxen. But again, it didn't make any sense because you had it out here on the outer part of the beach, and all the marshes grew back here. But then we realized that in fact what had happened is that it looked just like, you know, the hay wagon had gone by a week ago. It was nice fresh tracks. But in fact that had all happened in here, and the beach had rolled over about 200, almost 300 years, and that little strip was out on the outer beach. You'll see the same thing if you go down to Martha's Vineyard, some of the outer beaches down there, and after a storm you'll see strips of peat that are in the surf, and they're coming from, you know, from the marshes and the ponds behind. By the way, if anybody has any questions, by all means, put your hand up and fire away. Yeah.
I'm just wondering,
Yeah.
is nature trying to put it, in your opinion, back where it was, or will it proceed even further?
It keeps on going, but
Yeah.
because we are getting about 3 inches of sea level rise every 20 years. And that's enough. It doesn't sound like much, but if you, for instance, you know, 3 inches could have meant the difference between flooding and not flooding New Orleans. The other interesting thing about New Orleans, and particularly a lot of places up here on the North Shore, is we have a lot of marshes. And for every mile of marsh, healthy marsh that you have, that dampens down the storm surge by about a foot. And what they've done down in Louisiana is they've been pumping a lot of oil out, and so the land has actually been compacting, exactly. And then also they would dig canals through the marshes. And what these do, the marshes down, actually Louisiana doesn't have any beaches. All it has is it has about 100 miles of marsh. So the first 50 miles is a freshwater marsh, and the second 50 miles is a saltwater marsh. They look kind of the same. I was down there a number of years ago, and we were tootling around the marsh, and it looked like you could be in Rowley or something like that. And then all of a sudden you look down and there was an alligator swimming along, and you'd do your work over here and you'd look back and the alligator would be a little closer and a little closer and finally would get out of there. But what happens is when they would dig these canals to bury the pipelines coming in from the offshore rigs, it would allow the salt water to get into the freshwater marsh, and then the marshes would just start falling apart. So all of Louisiana is just losing all of these marshes at an incredible rate. I think they lose the equivalent of a football field every 10 seconds down there. So you literally, people can go out, spend the day out fishing and come back, and 10 feet from their back lawn will have gone into the bayou. Yes. Oh. Yeah, go ahead.
You talk about Nauset in the book here?
Yeah.
Yeah, I used to fish on Nauset Beach.
Okay. Yeah.
There's a great fish in there.
Sure. Yeah.
Stripers.
Yeah.
Amazing what happens every year on that beach. It's just incredible.
The other thing, of course, is that with this new inlet, you've all been hearing about the sharks that are appearing down in Chatham. Well, the first thing, when the inlet opened up, you started getting a lot of gray seals that were coming in. And the reason that we have so many gray seals is that they passed the Marine Mammal Act a number of years ago. And so the number of seals have been coming back, and lo and behold, there's a lot of food around, and the sharks have been finding that. I have a feeling it was one shark that figured that out. Actually, a number of years ago, actually a friend of mine was leading people on a little seal cruise down in Chatham, and they went into this tide pool. It was fairly, probably 4 or 5 feet deep and everything like that, and they had the boat in there, and they looked back and they saw a couple fins, and the woman said, what's that? And this guy said, oh, it's a pair of moonfish, not a big deal. And then all of a sudden she looked over and she said, that's a really big fish. And it was a great white shark, and they proceeded to watch it actually attack a seal, and they got some film of it. Nobody's ever found the film, but anyway, about a month later, a similar sized shark went into a pond off of Woods Hole, and I don't know if you remember this, but it was in there for about 2 weeks. And all kinds of people came down, the press were all there. I remember a lot of my friends were charging $100 an hour to ferry people out so that they could take pictures of it. I had another friend who he was one of the scientists down there, and he would go out in this little rowboat, and they knew that they just watched the shark, and she would sort of swim around this pond, and then there was one spot that she would always come to the surface, and then she'd go back down. So he'd move his boat over, and when she came to the surface, he'd pat her, and she went. I don't recommend this, but but anyway, so so now we have the great white sharks that are down there, and I think they're apex predators, and people spend thousands of dollars to go on safaris to Africa to see apex predators. So now we've got some in our own backyard. Yeah. Yes.
When you were talking about the beach rolling over, it rolls over towards the ocean?
No, it's rolling over towards the mainland.
Oh,
because
the other way.
It's being driven by the sea level rise. So it happens. It happens every day, and it's a combination of, in the summer, some of the sand will dry up and the sand will be blown back off the beach and into the marshes. So that's happening imperceptibly every day. But then you'll get a major storm, like the perfect storm, for instance, and that will take 60 feet, maybe 100 feet off the front of the beach, and then roll it over the back of the beach. And so the beach is essentially just rolling over. And if you if you allow that to happen, you're maintaining that as a natural barrier. So you're protecting the mainland. You know, so that's really what you want to do. Yeah.
How does that compare to Plum Island? What's happening in Plum Island now?
Oh, okay. I was trying to avoid that. Unfortunately, actually, what's happening in Plum Island is the winds tend to come in right at the center of the island, and then it creates longshore currents, both going to the south towards Ipswich and to the north towards Merrimack River. And so what's, you know, back in probably the 30s, maybe the 50s, when, you know, people put groins, and what a groin will do is it will, it's perpendicular to the shore, so all the sand that's coming down on that longshore current will fill up like that. And that's great, and that will, you know, protect all the houses up here. But what it does is it increases the amount of erosion because there's no sand going, you know, down here. So this is the reason that they don't want to have groins out there. Most of the houses that are in trouble now are on this part of the groin. We actually went down there and filmed before Hurricane Sandy. We filmed there actually in the summer, and then right before Sandy, they got permission to do what's called beach scraping. And essentially what they did is they scraped the beach at low tide and then built it up. So it was about 40 feet worth of sand up toward the houses. As a matter of fact, I have a picture that I took. There was a party before before the storms hit, and you know, everybody's sitting there on the porch, and there's a little stairs going down to the beach. I went back after the storm, and those stairs are hanging about 40 feet in the air. So 40 feet of sand was washed away in basically 2 high tides. The first high tide took about 30 feet of all that sand that had been put in there. Because it's loose when they just scrape it off the beach, it hasn't been compacted by the waves, it just washes away. So, you know, thousands of dollars worth of sand that everybody put, you know, up here to protect their houses are now protecting their neighbors down here. They've got a nice beach in front of them. And then what happens is that after that original sand, well, when I first went down there and I saw it, and I said, well, you know, it's going to slow things down. You know, at least it's sort of a sacrificial dune, and it's going to take some time to, you know, for the waves to wash it away. In fact, what happened is it actually speeded up erosion, because after that initial 30 feet of sand was washed away, then because you had scraped offshore, you were kind of funneling the waves right towards those beaches, so that took another 10 feet of erosion. So you've got the 40 feet of erosion that occurred essentially overnight. And the interesting thing about that is that, you know, the whole New England coast was hit, but Plum Island was hit worse than anywhere else. So I think it really shows that the beach scraping, you know, had a deleterious effect.
So is Plum Island going away?
It's, you know, the real problem, I think, with Plum Island is they put in sewer lines and water lines back in 2004. And, you know, before that you had you know, nice little summer cottages. They didn't have any running water or electricity, maybe worth $20,000 or $30,000, maybe $50,000. And they were, you know, they were great. They were just, you know, they fit into the environment. Unfortunately, as soon as you put that infrastructure there, then everybody started winterizing the homes and making them bigger and bigger and bigger, also building them out, you know, close to the edge of the dune. So now you've got a real problem, and actually Hurricane Sandy, even though it was a glancing blow, actually damaged the water mains. And everybody's being hush-hush about it, because I imagine there's going to be some lawsuits, probably against the engineers, but in fact, I think everybody is kind of culpable. Because they had to bend all kinds of regulations to get that infrastructure built in there, because it's, you know, you don't want to have water mains below a sandbar essentially, or a sand dune. So I don't know if anybody has, you know, vested interests here, but I feel very, very badly for the people who are there, and they're all very nice, and you know, we've been they invited me to all their parties, and and you know, the irony is not lost on me. You know, we have a very similar situation. We have a house on the Cape, and it's on a bank. It's not quite as exposed as Plum Island, but the writing is on the wall down there as well. And you know, I have to argue with my family, and you know what arguing with your family is like. You get nowhere. Yes. Any other questions? Yeah. Go ahead.
Do you see change in the animal and fish life as well that comes along with this?
Yeah,
You mentioned
absolutely.
seals and sharks.
Yeah, and actually the interesting thing is everybody's always assumed that with sea level rise, you are going to, you know, have damaging effects to the environment. And actually I remember when the first inlet opened up down in Chatham, what it did is we had the equivalent of about 50 years of sea level rise overnight.
Wow.
Because all of a sudden the bay was about 6 inches higher at high tide, about 6 inches lower at low tide. And a lot of the literature was saying that if you get more than 3 inches of sea level rise over, or half an inch over 3 years, I think maybe it was, the marshes will start dying because they'll actually drown in the salt water. And I looked at some marshes and I saw, you know, a lot of straw, and I figured, you know, this was what was going on. When we looked a little bit more carefully and we started taking measurements, we realized actually what was happening is that the marsh was both growing into the bay about 6 inches a year and into the uplands about 6 inches a year. So the marsh was getting larger, and it was the species, it was what's called alterniflora, which is the high marsh grass that you get at high tide, and that's about twice as productive as the Spartina patens, which makes up the upper marsh. So essentially you were increasing the productivity.
Productive in terms of its processing.
In producing detritus and food for, you know, for all the other animals. And, you know, estuaries are these nurseries for all the offshore fish, the fish that come in and go back out, and the freshwater fish. You know, it's 10 times more productive than your most productive wheat field. And that's all without having to plow it, put fertilizer on it. You know, the tides fertilize it every single day, you know, twice a day. The other thing that happened after that inlet opened up, there had never been any blue mussels caught in that part of Pleasant Bay. The first summer after the inlet opened up, they caught 40,000 bushels of blue mussels. And then what happened, after you get the barrier beach goes down like this, then you get a cut. Then the southern portion of the beach will migrate over and connect to the mainland. And then what happened is you had this new area down here, and they called it the clam factory, and it actually increased the employment rate by about 1%, because there were about 200 fishermen who were making had been flipping hamburgers or unemployed, who were making a very good living digging soft shell clams after that. So, and actually, I think now people realize, and they probably don't say it very loud, but in fact, we wouldn't have healthy estuaries if we didn't have sea level rise. If for some reason the sea level stopped rising or started to go down, your estuaries would become very unhealthy. So, I mean, the other thing that happened very, very quickly when you had these inlets open, it flushed out Pleasant Bay. We had been getting a lot of eutrophication because everybody has septic systems around the bay that would lead, all the nitrogen into the system, and then you over fertilize the area, and water quality goes down. And as soon as we started getting this flush of new water, that cleared up, quite dramatically. Sorry, I didn't mean to get on that long riff. It's the troublemakers on this side of the audience. Any easy questions over here?
Can you tell us what causes sea rise?
Yeah, oh good, that's a really good question. It's actually, when I first found out about this, I was actually sitting right beside Al Gore, and we were both undergraduates at Harvard, and we were in this special seminar. And this guy, Roger Revelle, was coming from the West Coast, and he was showing us a graph of carbon dioxide. I'll have to mention to you that actually Al Gore was an official student in there, and I was auditing it because I didn't get in the course, and I'm still ticked off at Harvard. Anyway. But what we saw was this, they call it a sawtooth graph, that shows you, they started measuring carbon dioxide on Hawaii back in 1957, and it just shows you gradually the carbon dioxide going up, and it has this sawtooth pattern because you get more carbon dioxide in the winter and then more oxygen in the summer because all the leaves are giving off oxygen. So you get this sort of sawtooth pattern. But it's been going up and up and up and up. And as soon as you knew that the carbon dioxide was going up, you knew you were going to have the greenhouse effect, and you knew you were going to have global warming, and you knew you were going to have sea level rise. And we all figured, well, now that the scientists know about it, it'll all be solved in 4 years, and it won't be anything for us to do when we get out of college. And you know what we've done about global warming since then?
Zero.
Exactly, zero. I was just coming over here tonight, and they were saying that China produces more electricity from coal than the rest of the world combined. And coal and a lot of that coal comes from the United States. We actually export it to China. And coal is about 4 times more dirtier than oil. And oil is dirtier than natural gas. So what you want to get away from is get away from the coal. And I won't say anything. I'm a NIMBY on fracking, by the way. If somebody wants to frack underneath their house, I'll be glad to buy the cheap gas, but I don't want it under my house. I don't want to get in trouble saying that. Yes? Any
So
other
carbon dioxide is what causes sea rise? Is that the
So,
answer to the question?
oh, good, I'm glad you, thank you, okay. So that's what's causing the warming. And essentially we've been getting about 1 foot of sea level rise ever since the glaciers have been, ever since the ice age and the glaciers have been retreating. In about the last 20 years, we've been getting about 1.5 feet of sea level rise every 100 years. And you probably remember, if you go down to a beach that you went to as a kid, you'll remember, when the beach might have been 100 feet, maybe 200 feet wide. Now you'll go down there and, the high tides will be lapping at the dunes. And that's because of this increase by about 6 inches of sea level rise, 1.5 feet over every 100 years. The reason for that is that the oceans themselves have warmed up, and that has expanded the volume of the oceans. So that's accounting for that. Then what people are concerned about is that if you have land glaciers, like in the Alps or places like that, and they're all melting, that will account for another about 8 feet of sea level rise. And then if Antarctica starts melting, Greenland this summer was the first, it was the first time that the entire surface of Greenland was covered with meltwater. And it was just, the whole thing was melting. And then what would happen is a hole would open up, and all of that water would come cascade. It would be the equivalent of about 7 Niagara Falls, would cascade down through the hole in the glacier, and then that would lubricate the bottom of the glacier, and then the glacier would move faster toward the ocean. So that's one of the concerns. And then you probably also, and this doesn't have anything to do with sea level rise, but we had the least amount of ice in the Arctic this summer that we've ever had. And as a matter of fact, now there are ships that are now transporting oil across the Arctic Ocean. So sometimes it feels like we're living in a rerun of the Twilight Zone. All these things are happening so fast, and literally I think there are probably oil companies that one division of the oil company will be saying that there's no such thing as global warming and all this stuff isn't happening, and another division will be figuring out how they can ship oil across the nice ocean. Yes.
Yeah, that guy you mentioned that was in the course, I forget his name now.
Oh, Roger Lavelle? Oh, Thor.
He made a movie,
Right.
and suggested that the rate is actually increasing dramatically, and
Yeah.
that it's going to be more than 3 inches,
Yeah.
Is that something you
Yeah.
think is a possibility?
Yeah,
Are we looking at a greater?
The sort of rule of thumb that I always use, and it sort of comes right out of Woods Hole, is that we can expect to get about 3 feet of sea level rise in the next 100 years. We've gone from 1 foot to 1.5 feet, and we'll probably get about 3 feet. If some of these other things happen, it could be appreciably more than that. But I tend to sort of keep to the conservative.
So Georgetown will be beachfront property.
Sure, yeah, and you might want to plant some citrus fruits. Actually, I just did an article about what would happen if Sandy had hit the North Shore, and basically about half of all of the land area in the coastal towns would have been in it. You'd get about 50 extra feet of water.
Wow.
Because you'd get 8 feet of sea level rise, of storm surge, you'd get 30-foot waves, plus you'd get the high tide. So in all, you'd get 50 feet of waves. And we've probably all seen these what people call the bathtub ring models that shows you what will happen in 100 years if you have 3 feet of sea level rise, or 6 feet, or 9 feet. But it's it would be like on a nice August day. But what you have to watch out for is a major storm like Sandy that could hit next week, and then you're not talking about 3 feet of sea level rise. You're talking about 50 feet of water coming in a single storm. So you'll probably have a lot of environmental refugees, coming from Ipswich and Rowley up, that will be moving into Georgetown. So, yeah.
What do you think it's gonna take for Congress to get out of the denial of global warming?
I think I'm probably a little bit more optimistic now than, it was unbelievable to me that it was just never ever mentioned, during the whole presidential election. I mean,
Yes.
nobody mentioned it.
Incredible.
And then Sandy knocked on the door, and reminded everybody, hey, So I think, and actually, what's going on now in New Jersey is kind of interesting, and I think a lot of it has to do with the personal relationship between Obama and Christie. They really formed a very, close bond, and they realized they have to work together to make these things happen. One of the interesting things is that FEMA, that provides the National Flood Insurance Program, most of the money is in a big pot, and so if your house gets destroyed, you get the fair market value of your house to rebuild it in the same spot, which doesn't make too much sense. They have a smaller pot of money. It's sort of an experimental program, and that says you get the fair value of your house, and you can do whatever you want with it. You can move to Georgetown or the mountains, or send your kids through college. And I think that's what's you know, that's the more progressive thing to do, and I think that's beginning to happen. After Hurricane Katrina, Louisiana had regulations, so you had to build on the same spot. Mississippi, which we don't think of as a particularly progressive state, but they actually had it set up so that you could take the money and do whatever you wanted with it. Yeah.
Troublemaker again.
Okay. I like your questions.
I'm listening to the pieces. You've talked about our infrastructure,
Yeah.
destroying the substrate, about the storms, the sea
Yeah.
rise.
Yeah.
What about overfishing? How does that fit into the whole, or are we not overfishing? Is it the stock that we've got that is changing?
We're definitely overfishing.
Yeah.
And global warming is having some effect on that, but it's essentially it's the overfishing.
It is.
And the best fisheries management has always been world wars, or any kind of war. You'll notice that after every war, the fish stock just zips right up.
Because the fishermen are in the area.
Because nobody's been fishing for 4 or 5 years, and then they'll be fished down again. And actually, I'm glad you. That reminds me. I actually I had two. Well, this book I wrote after the BP spill, and there were about 5 or 6 major publishers that were writing books about the BP spill. And I was working on another book, and I didn't have a chance to write my proposal, so I didn't, I wasn't in, there to get in advance and, get a contract with them. But I felt that I had something to say, and I decided, well, okay, I'll just, I'll go ahead and I'll self-publish it. The only good thing about that is that all the other guys went down there right in the beginning, and they were kind of right there when it looked like a huge crisis because you had this amazing amount of oil that was going into the system, and people were saying the fisheries would never recover, and the oysters wouldn't recover, and the shrimp and everything like that. In fact, what they found is that the shrimp industry actually increased, their catch increased, and it was the same thing because nobody was able to fish for a year, and so
Let them recover.
They let them recover. The same thing happened during the Ictoc spill that happened in the 60s down off of Mexico. So some people were kind of expecting that. So the only good thing is all these guys were writing about this disaster and all these terrible things in their first few chapters, and we were all racing each other, to see who could get the first book out. Because the first book sells about 80%, 80% of the sales of the first book, and all the other, they might be much better books, but they don't sell. But anyway, so these guys were saying what a terrible thing it was because I didn't have a huge advance. I wasn't able to get down there right away. So I talked to friends at Woods Hole and MIT and Harvard and various things like that. And by the time I went down there, I had the feeling that we've kind of dodged a bullet. It's not as bad as it looked like it was going to be. So I didn't have to backpedal quite as much. These other guys, that all of a sudden in the last chapters, they kind of said, well, maybe it's not so bad. Exactly the opposite thing happened, and I don't see it here. I have this book. Again, this was after the Fukushima disaster. If you could believe it, this is the only book written in English about Fukushima. As far as I know, it's been over a year now, and usually all the books come out about a year afterwards. The reason for that is none of the publishers made money on the BP spill. So when this happened, nobody would touch an environmental book. And
Except self-publishers.
exactly. Yeah. I'll accept any donations. But again, and actually, I've had a lot of, this is actually being used in several Japanese universities. And I've had a lot of Japanese people that said I really kind of hit it right. I was dealing a lot with the culture of Japan and why this had happened how it happened and how they rallied and everything like that. It allowed me to reread, you know, all of Edwin Reischauer's books and stuff like that. So it was kind of interesting.
Do you focus on the environment of that, of the culture, of the
It was
nuclear disaster?
Pretty much. I did kind of the whole gamut. I mean, even though it's sort of thin.
Yeah.
I think one of the interesting things is Japan hadn't, all the universities hadn't accepted the theory of plate tectonics, and I think, does everybody understand the theory of plate tectonics? Well, it came in this country, actually when I took my geology course at Harvard, we called it Rocks for Jocks, but anyway, but at that time, the theory was just coming in, and the department was split down the middle between the old guys who said that the Earth was contracting, and that's why the mountains sort of wrinkled up like an old prune or something like that. And so what they did is they said, okay, they taught the whole course as a debate between half of the department and the other half. So that was in the late '60s and early '70s. And it was pretty well, I mean, even us, Callow undergraduates, realized, who was on the winning side. So it was pretty much accepted within the academic universities, and they were trying to, there was a lot of academic politics going on, and they try to, hire the new young scientists with the new ideas. So they were gradually building up the plate tectonics credentials in the geology department. But that didn't happen because of academic politics in Japan. So it was the old guard that was still in charge of the geology departments. So they built, all their 50 nuclear power plants in exactly the wrong place. Wow. So that, they built them right along the coast, and that the plate was subducting about 50 miles offshore, and it subducts, and then that's what creates the earthquakes and everything like that. And then of course, and then it happens out here, and then you get the tsunamis running. So they were built in exactly the wrong in the wrong place because of that. Yep.
What do you think about the Seabrook plant? Do you think that was built in the right place?
Probably not. I look across, right across the marsh at it. And nuclear energy is kind of interesting. Actually, I was invited to give a talk to an anti-nuclear group.
Brave man.
Well, I was then disinvited because because I sent my little description of the lecture, and then in part of the lecture I talked about there is the idea that you can build a small modular nuclear power plant similar to, we've had nuclear power plants in nuclear submarines for the past 50 years. And as everybody in the Navy says, we're sleeping beside them. Actually, they store the beer beside them. But anyway, if you look at a schematic, the beer is right here, and the nuclear power plant is over there. That's in my slide. But anyway, so I think there is an argument that could be made that you could have small modular plants that might be ancillary to other plants. And if you're concerned about global warming, and if you've been concerned about it for 40 years, that is, I think, at least something to consider. Frankly, I'm against it because I just don't. I think nuclear is just too dangerous, basically. But I think, part of the idea with that is that you could build a plant that's so small that if you did have any kind of a catastrophe, it could be contained. But yeah, So don't try to tell the whole truth. You'll get disinvited. Yeah,
I'm sorry, I came in late, so in case I'm repeating, forgive me.
that's okay.
But the,
I came in late too, so.
we've, from what I've heard, and I'm not sure of my facts,
Yeah.
had a mini ice age from like the 17th century on.
Yeah.
Krakatoa in the mid-19th century
Yeah,
blocked out the sun. We had another.
the year
cold
without a,
surge. Yeah, real without the summer.
without a summer, yeah.
Snowed every month
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
of the year.
yeah.
Are those considered anomalies in the database?
Certainly the volcanoes are considered anomalies, because what they do is they spew a lot of sulfur dioxide into the air. And then that tends to cool the climate, and that will last for 2 or 3 years. So
That's all.
you'll see a cooling there.
Yeah.
You have had some of these cooling eras. They have to do with things like, well, the whole process, you have what are called the Milankovitch cycles, and that's it has to do with the angle that the planets are in and the sun and everything like that. And that's what will drive you into ice ages and coming back out again. Actually, in fact, in terms of the natural system, our climate should be cooling. The fact that it's getting as warm as it is, I think, just shows you how much the greenhouse effect is actually affecting things. So I often say it's a little bit like if you walk into a greenhouse, and sure, the sun, may be up here and, may be angled that way, and there may be all kinds of other things, but the main thing when you walk into that greenhouse, the reason that it's 20 or 30 degrees warmer is because you have the greenhouse effect, because the glass tends to do the same thing that the carbon dioxide.
How long is the Blankenship cycle? How many years is the Blankenship cycle?
Oh, the Milankovitch cycles?
Milankovitch.
It's a series of cycles. And I think there's one that's 30,000 and another is like about 300,000. And it all depends on where, the angle of all of these things are.
Is most of the data from the ice cores in Greenland, is that the long-term data?
Yeah, and again, you'll see some of these changes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Last question. Who has it?
I think we had some edification on the
Well,
Milankovitch cycles that I've been avoiding.
The Milankovitch cycle is mostly the elasticity of the Earth orbit.
Right.
It gets more and less
Yeah.
elliptical.
Yeah.
And it's about 100,000 years.
I think 100,000
Yeah.
years. Yeah.
My
And
last
we should
question.
be
I'm sorry.
going into the ice age instead of going into the.
Exactly.
And,
Yeah. Yeah. There's another kind of an interesting cycle that I find as a practical thing, if you're concerned about how your house is going to fare over the next 10 years. If you look at what are called the Proxygean tides, and the Proxygean tides occur when the moon is closest to the Earth. Do you remember about, I think it was a number of years ago, do you remember how big the moon was? I mean, it was, that was real. It wasn't an optical illusion. The moon was about 30,000 miles closer to the Earth than it normally is. And you get these Proxygean tides. Proxygean just simply means that the planets, the planet, the Earth, the Sun, and the Moon are all lined up, and that they're closest. And these go through the system so that you'll have the highest tides of the year will occur 14 months later. So if this year our highest tides are in September, next year they'll be in November, and then the next year they'll be a couple months later and a couple months later. And if you look at those high tides, that will tell you, if you look at a month and say you have, sometimes you might have 15 days over, say, a 15-foot tide, then you've got a very high probability of having some damage done. But the following month, you might only have 5 days where the tides will go over 15 feet. So what you could do is just buy a tide chart and then mark on it, you know, how many, how high it's going above your normal tide. So if you normally get a 14-foot tide, and then an extravagant one would be a 15-foot tide, then you just put a box around all of those, and it gives you that little window of vulnerability. I'm sorry, I got into another long riff. Yes, go ahead.
I was just, do it quick. Which book
Yep.
will tell us what? The first two are about the rollover, the storm surge?
Yeah, this was about the, the first inlet that opened up in Chatham, and let's see, I have another one that's also about that. And then this one, this is my most recent one, and it's called 10,000 Years on a Barrier Beach. And that looks at the 10,000 years history of the, again, it's the Chatham system. But I go back to when the woolly mammoth and the mastodon were around, and then I take it through, you know, pirates and moon cussers and rum runners and various, you know, right up to the present. Okay, yeah.
Well, my turn to interrupt. We're going to thank you for coming, and we have still some time in case people want to come up and purchase some of your books and maybe get a signature from you.
Okay.
We wanted to give you a book,
Oh, wonderful.
and this is artwork by John Singer Sargent.
You might know him.
Common last name. Bill is actually a descendant of the artist John Singer Sargent, and you have another relative that we might recognize today.
I'm not sure.
Your dad?
Politician?
His dad is a former governor of Massachusetts, Frank Sargent, so.
And I can make really good stick figures.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
That's wonderful.
Thank you.
I won't sell this one.
No, you can't, it was donated.
And I actually have a daily blog called the Coastlines Project. And it is www.coastlinesproject.org. I think that's how you get to it. I don't know, it's all.